Hello, this PowerPoint is intended to help you review what you have read and taken some notes on. It is on the Constitutional Convention and its results. So where did this take place? Philadelphia, in Independence Hall, the same place that the colonists met for the Continental Congress meetings beginning in 1774, because New York City and Boston were patrolled by British regulars. The oldest delegate at the Constitutional Convention was Benjamin Franklin. At the time that it convened, he was 81. You may recall that Benjamin Franklin had arrived to the Continental Congress meetings carried in that sedan chair, which was a seat enclosed in a cabin carried by two men known, interestingly, as chairmen, one in the front and one in the back. While the age of 81 way outpaced the average life expectancy of 38 years in America in 1787, this was largely due to infant mortality rates. Once you reach the age of 60, you are likely to see 75. Several of the founding fathers were not present at this important convention. For example, Thomas Jefferson was an ambassador to Paris in 1784, joining Benjamin Franklin in developing and solidifying the relationship between France and the new United States. John Adams was in London as America's first minister to Great Britain. He was hoping to open British ports to American ships to help with trade and secure the removal of British troops from American soil, as they had agreed to do in the Treaty of Paris. He met with King George III just once. Little was accomplished overall in the 5 years he spent in Great Britain. And finally, Patrick Henry. He did not go to the Constitutional Convention because he said he didn't believe that the Articles of Confederation were just going to be changed a little. He said, "I smelt a rat," about the intentions of the delegates, and he was worried that they would take power away from the states and give them to a all too powerful federal government. So he refused to go at all. At the convention, George Washington was elected unanimously as president of the Constitutional Convention. His usual humble self, he stated that while, quote, "it is probable that no plan we propose will be adopted," end quote, he accepted the position to oversee the convention, which ultimately improved his visibility as a leader and led to his election as the first president of the United States. James Madison served as the secretary of the convention and became known later as Father of the Constitution. As the note-taker, much of his wording was eventually used in the text of the Constitution itself. The United States Constitution was modeled on other successful examples of government. One of these was the English Magna Carta, Latin for Great Charter. This document famously guaranteed the rights of all people, including the right to a fair trial, as well as establishing that everyone is to be held accountable to the law, including the king. King John signed this Magna Carta in 1215. Another model for the United States Constitution was the Native American collection of nations called the Iroquois Confederacy. 5 tribal nations agreed to maintain their independent status while also agreeing to come together and share resources, as well as defend each other against common enemies. This would become the model for the United States government system, federalism, which means that we have one national government which holds certain powers, as well as states, which maintain their own powers as well. One of the biggest, most challenging debates at the Constitutional Convention was how states should be represented in Congress. States with large populations, like Virginia, wanted more voice in Congress, while smaller population states like New Jersey wanted representation to remain equal, just as it had been under the Articles of Confederation. As you saw in our class constitutional convention simulation, compromise was going to be essential in order to solve the problem of representation in Congress. A compromise is two or more sides giving something up in order to reach an agreement. And in this case, they decided to make two parts or houses of Congress. In order to answer this problem of representation in Congress, the founders created an upper house called the Senate, which was equal for all states. 2 representatives per state are sent to the Senate, and today there are a total of 100 senators. Our current senators are Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey. The House of Representatives, considered the lower house, is based upon population reflecting the Virginia plan. And more population states have larger numbers of representatives. Today there are 435 representatives in the House of Representatives. And the representative from Needham is Joe Kennedy, whom you had the good fortune to meet earlier this year. The issue of slavery was another compromise that needed to be struck. The South wanted slaves to count in the population so that they could increase their representation in Congress. The North, on the other hand, did not want slaves to count in the population at all because they wanted slavery eliminated. What they decided was some of the states' slaves would count for their population count, but not all of the slaves would count. And so, this 3/5 compromise determined that for every 5 slaves, only 3 would count towards the population of that state. They finally agreed to a trade compromise. What they decided at the Constitutional Convention was the federal government can regulate international trade with other countries, which makes sense, but they should also be able to regulate trade between the states, called interstate trade, just in case any problems arose between the states. The federal government wanted to be able to have the final word. However, states themselves can regulate trade inside their borders, called intrastate trade. On the topic of taxing trade, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention decided that Congress should be able to tax goods coming into the country. These imports are taxed, thereby making foreign goods more expensive overall, like chocolate made in Germany, Lindt chocolate bars, are typically more expensive in U.S. supermarkets than Hershey bars, which are made right in Pennsylvania. On the other hand, exports, or goods exiting or leaving the country, are not taxed because this encourages American products to thrive overseas, thereby helping American businesses. As we know, one of the main problems that they argued about at the Constitutional Convention was slavery. And it became clear that slavery was not going to be abolished, no matter how much the northern states wanted it. What they agreed to, though, was a revisiting of the slavery issue. And they decided that in 20 years, they could consider eliminating the slave trade. This ends up being enacted in 1808. Now, we remember that the slave trade from Africa started in 1619 in Jamestown. By the middle of the 1700s, all 13 colonies used American slaves for labor. Finally, in 1808, when Congress abolished the slave trade, there were 4 million slaves being used in the South. Even after this enactment of the slave trade being abolished, trade among southern states continued, and slave children were a valuable commodity among these populations. Now you remember Patrick Henry was famously missing from the Constitutional Convention because he smelt a rat. He was suspicious of the new system of government because while necessary powers would be taken by the federal government, like raising a military, he feared that the federal government could become a tyranny and take too much power. As an ardent Virginian, Patrick Henry eventually voted against this new system of government called federalism, which was the sharing of powers between federal and state governments. It's what makes the United States unique. And so Patrick Henry becomes a famous anti-federalist, part of a group that opposed the Constitution because they feared it potentially gave too much power to this federal government and that not enough power was retained by the states. Federalists, on the other hand, were determined to make this document the basis for the new U.S. government. A series of 85 newspaper articles were published in New York, written by 3 anonymous writers. They called themselves Publius, meaning of the people. It was also a name taken from the great Roman Publius Valerius Pubicola, who was instrumental in founding the Republic in Rome. These writers wrote anonymously so as not to have a personal connection to the movement and let people decide for themselves based upon the document. Later it was revealed that these 3 writers were James Madison, no surprise, the father of the Constitution, along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. As we know, the Constitution was ratified or approved as the basis of our United States system of government. Small states loved the document because they maintained a voice equal to other states in the Senate and also retained powers over their individual states. So Delaware was the first state, as their license plate famously reminds us, and several other small states quickly followed in ratification. Massachusetts asked for the addition of a Bill of Rights. Remember, Massachusetts people lost their rights to assemble, to have guns, to be free of troops being quartered in their homes, and to be free of search and seizure. Remember the writs of assistance? John Hancock does, after the seizing of his Spanish wine on his ship, the Liberty. So Massachusetts pushed for the addition of a guarantee of personal freedoms called the Bill of Rights. It was agreed that these freedoms would be added. This Bill of Rights, the first 10 additions or amendments to the U.S. Constitution, would be added in 1791. And with that guarantee, Massachusetts ratified the Constitution. After this, New Hampshire famously became the 9th state, which made the Constitution official. The larger states, Virginia and New York, finally agreed, and all of the states were on board except Rhode Island. Remember, Rhode Island had elected not to send a representative to the Constitutional Convention? Well, realizing later that they could not survive on their own, independently, they eventually ratified in 1790. The United States has a new Constitution. The Articles of Confederation is behind us. And over the course of all of those years since 1791, when the Bill of Rights was added, only 17 other amendments have been made to that document.